Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Can you all hear me? Jolly good. This afternoon's speaker is Tony Warren, a sometime boy actor who, when he outgrew his talents, perhaps, sat down and created the most successful and long-running television soap in British television history, Coronation Street, which last year celebrated its 50th anniversary. Tony has known all sorts of people and is a fond of stories. One of his great friends in his early days was a Kemp Town resident, Douglas Byng, born in 1893, who died in 1987 at the age of 93, having done his last stage performance a mere 8 months before his death. Dougie had been one of the highest paid cabaret performers in the world. He was a success on both sides of the Atlantic. He worked on stage as a cabaret performer, he worked on stage as an actor. I think the only of his theatrical performances that's been preserved is a film of a very naff Fado play, which he did with Alec Guinness and Martita Hunt. And it was made into a film directed by Peter Glanville. My brain's gone, I can't remember the title of it.
Hotel Paradise.
That's it, yes. There you go. There's always a prompt somewhere in that house. He was an extraordinarily nice, dapper, elderly gentleman when I knew him, when he lived on Arundel Terrace. Like so many people of his generation that I've been lucky enough to know when I was reasonably young and they were relatively ancient. He was memorable because, if nothing else, the Edwardian good manners. He was always immaculately dressed. He would never allow one to smoke one's own cigarettes. If you smoked the silver cigarette case, the silver cigarette box would come out. Have mine. Wonderful politeness. A terrific person. Tony knew him extremely well many years before I came on the scene. Tony's going to sensibly speak from the lectern without this confounded machine. Tony Warren on Dougie Byng.
Thank you very much indeed. Douglas Byng was a great West End musical and revue star of the 1920s, 30s and 40s. And not only that, he was the highest paid cabaret artist in the world. And Dougie never did anything by heart. He is acknowledged now, even after his death, as one of the greatest pantomime dames of all time. No coward described him as the most refined vulgarity in London. James Agent, the critic, said of him, Dougie Byng is not near the knuckle, he is the knuckle. So how can I talk about him in church? Well, strangely enough, I can. Dougie was a believer, and though you may find it hard to believe, he has a direct family link with this church. But you have to stay to the end to hear that. He had links with everywhere. In Brighton, he always would point out a hotel to me and say, that's where my Uncle Simpson chased the landlady round the dining table after something very untoward indeed. He was 95 at the time. My father said he should be locked in a mental institution. I said he should be knighted. Let me tell you how Dougie came into my life. I was born in 1936, and not long afterwards my father answered a very cryptic advertisement in the Manchester Guardian for linguists and for crossword experts. And in next to no time, he was at an Oct2, and I wasn't even at school at the time. He was an intelligence officer with MI13 in the Middle East. And I didn't know him. He'd arranged with Blackwell's, the Oxford bookseller, to send me a parcel of books every month. And he also, there was various sweet shops across the Middle East. He asked to send Turkish Delight, and they used to arrive sewn up in brown canvas, and with the postman complaining because sugar was sifted down. And I really thought that was my father. And also, all those young officers got Leicas. And these Leica cameras, they all took pictures of one another. And so one day a picture arrived, Captain Luprega, band leader in brackets, and another arrived, No Koi Byng. I think he was Captain No Koi Byng by that time. Brother Douglas Byng, actor. Well, I was a totally stage-struck child. This was meat and drink to me. Oh, and I certainly knew who Douglas Byng was. I had 2 cigarette cards of him. I had one of him as a very dapper gentleman indeed, with a winning smile, and I had another of him as Queen Elizabeth in a red wig. And we had a theatrical connection. I was absolutely thrilled. The next time I came into my life, I was at Eccles Grammar School, and a good solid old school, and my best friend was a very solid boy, and he brought in a copy of Everybody's, which was rather like a poor man's cousin of a picture post. And in Everybody's, there was a picture of what it looked really like a Marchioness. She was very jewelled, and she had a white powdered high hair and a tiara. And he said, "This is very rum indeed. It's a man, and he sends his jewels to a Bond Street jeweller to be cleaned." There again was Dougie. And I said, "Oh, we know him." We did, because I was determined I was going to. And now my real name is Tony Simpson, and Equity made me change it because there was already a very well-established actor called Tony Simpson. He and his family lived on St Martin's Lane. They lived in Goodwin's Court, that little alleyway opposite what was then the New Theatre and is now the Albury. And they had...
Now the Coward. It's been changed.
Is it the Coward again? Yeah. Oh, the Coward. Sorry. You see, I live in the past. And it's more comfortable sometimes. And so, anyway, there's an archway. You go up it. Peggy Ramsey, the literary agent, used to be on one side. And then there was both fronted houses. And the 2 brothers had a house each. And Tony had one of the tall ones at the end. And it had wonderful, and that family adopted me. They gave me a bedroom in the attic of one of the houses. They were always finding ways of inviting me to meals, because I was very young, and sometimes I worked very hard and played quite impressive roles, and other times, well, I was allowed to pose for knitting patterns. But Dougie, the house of Dougie's had a twisted staircase, and it was lined with all his triumphs. And in one, he'd been in a review with Dougie Byng. And he said, "We will meet him one day." Because sooner or later, everybody turned up in those houses. It was like a West End theatrical parcel office. People used to knock on the door and say, "Could I just leave this for half an hour?" And I met incredible people incredibly early. And one afternoon, there was a knock on the door, and I opened the door to a great big beaming smile, a lot of Hawes and Curtis tailoring, a whiff of Florence Rose geranium, and there was the man on the cigarette card. There was Douglas Byng. And on the strength of those tenuous connections that my father had been in the army with his brother, that I was semi-adopted by the Simpsons, we became great, great friends. And I've gone beyond there as well. But I hasten to add, this was a highly circumspect friendship. And he taught me long before other people had realised it, there was no such thing as the generation gap. He just bridged it, and that was that. And I recently, I don't know if anybody saw it, there was a play on television called The Road to Coronation Street, which was about how I first wrote the show. And Charles Sturridge, who directed it, who Derek probably talked about yesterday afternoon, because he directed Brideshead as well. Charles Sturridge said, now this boy who's playing you, I want to let him get to know you as much as he possibly can, because I wanted him to soak it all up. And so poor David Dawson, who was not quite as tall as I was left looking up at me, and what do we do now? And it was easy. I just turned into Dougie, and he had to be me. And we became great, great friends, and people said, isn't it? And I realise now what people have said. Then isn't it astonishing? Those two are sitting in a corner howling their heads off. But we've remained great friends. And here I do the commercial. You may have seen him in Luther on television a couple of weeks ago, but he's now at the Don Mar warehouse in Schiller's Louise Miller. And I wish he was here this afternoon. I didn't think to ask him, but never mind. Dougie quite simply invited me down to Wastlands, which was his house in the country. And one took the train to Dorking, and then getting out at Dorking, there was Dougie in a little blue and fawn sports car. Now, nobody who knows Dougie believes that he drove me. He had a rather unfortunate affliction. Some people, the moment his name is mentioned, start to do an imitation of this affliction. It was a form of St. Vitus dance. Today, I think it would be called OCD, obsessive compulsion disorder. But a hand would shoot out in front of him and then pull back. And on very bad days, I've seen him even take a napkin and stuff it down the inside of his shirt. Those people who straight away did an imitation of him, I never liked. Somehow I thought, oh, that's what you're like, is it? It was a great indicator. But I was young enough, and we liked one another enough, to look curious when he said, it's very bad today, and he never referred to it. And I said, has it always been there? And he told me the whole story. He said, I had rheumatic fever, and then he said, a couple of years later, I was walking home from school, and he said it felt just like electric wires jerking me. And he said, some days it's absolutely terrible. My mother was absolutely convinced that I got it because she used a treadle sewing machine while she was pregnant. It wasn't meant to be funny, but I can see it funny now. The strange, I said to him, but you never do it on stage. And he said, aha, watch. And I did. Now, on the stage, he was very clever. The hands would go out like this, but suddenly they would go to a cuff, or they would go to a collar, and he was holding on to something to prevent it showing. It was quite remarkable how he disguised it. And Wastlands was a lovely house, long, low. There was a map in there of 1543 with Wastlands still on. A farmhouse, a big drawing room with low ceiling, and a log fire, and the smell of incense. In those days, very unusual. You used to get little cones from Fortnum and Mason, and you set fire to the top. And those and wood smoke. Oh, it was a wonderful smell. And there were bedrooms, 3, I think. But Dougie had this strange thing. Wherever he was, however grand his surroundings, or however humble, in fact there was an extra arch there, and through that were endless rooms. Oh, it was Chatsworth that way and Bewley that way. He just had the natural grand manner, despite the fact that he had to start to get the electricity going. He had to pull a thing that went like this out in a shed in the garden. And for the first time, I saw the photographs, and there was Alice Delicia, and there were large cabinet frames they were in, by his bedside, sometimes in the drawing room, sometimes by his bedside. Alice Delicia and Philip Carr, a young man of whom he was very, very fond, Stefan, who had been a lover during the war, and another lover, and then the Duke of Kent. Well, in those days, we always call Prince George. In those days, the Duke of Kent's signature was still in ink, but gradually it faded, so he retouched it. He also retouched a Deligram Fair and Lanier picture of himself as a society hostess, and he didn't use quite the right shade to do it. But, of course, Tommy, his dresser, and he always kept his dressers for donkeys, yes, but Tommy, his dresser, said, was walking down Bond Street with him one day, and Dougie said, Tommy, straighten that tie or bugger off, here comes Princess Marina. Of course, Dougie was very fond of royalty. In his autobiography, which somebody has today, he says he had a letter from a foreign princess who was requesting something. Well, I've had that letter in my hand, and it was not from a foreign princess at all. It said, Dear Mr. Byng, tonight we bring the Queen of Spain to your cabaret. Your best, dear Mr. Byng, but please, not your worst. And it was signed by the Queen Mother. On those visits, he taught me so much. He taught me more than anything I'd ever learned at theatre school. He would tell me about Alice, and I'd say, show me Alice Alicia, who we consider to be the greatest leading lady of all. And before you knew where you were, because he was then quite an elderly man, was descending the stairs. There was a staircase that did that. Doing some women like Canterbury Buttons and Pekingese, but not the none of these I like a man. And he would do Nellie Wallace. He and Nellie Wallace had the same agent. And Nellie Wallace used to, in a variety, actually, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. And he said, oh, I so admired her closing for the variety act. So she did a little poem. A maid may kiss a man goodbye. The sun may kiss a butterfly. The morning dew may kiss the grass. And you, my friend, farewell. And but he would say to me, no, you've got to do it again. I want the downward inflection on farewell. Because that was the brilliance of it. And he told me that he and Nellie Wallace had the same agent, a woman called Audrey Thacker. And he went in to see Audrey Thacker one day, and he barely got through the door when Nellie Wallace burst past and said, well, I've had a terrible time, a terrible, terrible, terrible time, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. And they said, well, what happened? And she said, well, I'm rehearsing for panto at Golders Green, I'm Mother Goose, I dive in the well. Do you know what the producer said to me? And then you come out and you're still ugly. I'm not happy. Well, they started. You're a beautiful woman, Nellie. You're a beautiful woman. We know that. Them buggers at Golders Green don't know it. And then, of course, he'd do snatches of his own songs. You know, oh, for the night in the ballroom. Oh, for the dancing at 10. Oh, Nellie's been wobbling jellies. How they excite all the men. Not in Nellie, she made them especially. Oh, also lively, so we rush up the drive. Oh, so the oak room is used as a cloakroom. Every arrangement complete, there's board. She's wearing a white cap. Don't leave your fan on the seat. And thus it went on. Another dresser was called Jack, and he'd married the landlady of the local pub. And he lived at it was called the Parrot, Rockley. And but we ate there sometimes, and then we would go to the Ivy. Dougie was the first person ever to take me to the Ivy, and I had enough French to get through the menu, and I couldn't have had a better teacher how to order, and the Caprice. And I was full of ambition, and he used to question me closely about my family, and he would talk about his own, and he came from a very solid middle-class family. His father was a bank director of the Midland Bank. He was a manager of a branch, but he and some friends had started the Midland Bank together. And it was a life of musical evenings and picnics by wagonette, and that world of calling cards and pince-nez, which is where he first saw women wearing pince-nez, and determined to copy them. And the very, very first performance he ever gave was when he was 3. He stood on a hassock and sang "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" as a lady. And by the time he was 7, he said to his mother, when they'd been to the pantomime, "I am going on the stage." And his mother said, "I hope, dear, it will never come to that." When he went to a strange school, a private school, for the sons of, I suppose, merchant class gentlemen. But then he went, Nottingham was the centre of the lace industry, and his brother had a lace factory in Saxony. So he went to Saxony for a year, and he didn't really see much future for himself there. But the family in the meantime had moved to Catford. So he came back to London and he got a job. And he got a job working for Alias, the theatrical costumier. And Charles Alias had premises in Soho Square. And he also had something that was called the Persian Room within that. And all the great stars were allowed into the Persian Room. And Dougie would watch almost through the keyhole people like Dorothy Ward and Toots Pounds and Lorna Pounds, who were the English Dolly sisters. And it's strange that those women were to become his closest friends. But Monsieur Alias used to come over from Paris. They made all the Palladium costumes, and fortunes were spent on them, absolute fortunes. And Monsieur Alias would stand looking at them, and then he would. The thread was always left untied. That they were taken to the theatre, and then the final thread was tied for luck in the theatre. And Monsieur Alias would look at this costume over which they'd lavished for weeks and say, "Well, it's the best I can do for the money." Now, this was one of Dougie's favourite expressions for the rest of his life. And that when he always had his bath in the morning. He would get out of the bath, he draped himself in a maroon dressing gown with navy lapels, and then he'd flash the legs and say, "Hey, well, you see, not that, eh? They'd be compared with Miss Stonegate, you know." And then he said, "Of course, the legs are always the last thing to go." I still find myself saying it. I said it to a well-known actress the other day and didn't realise what I'd done. That was a little inheritance I could have done without. But then he would dress, and then he'd be furious with me if I just found a little mark on there, trained by him, and I just went in the mouth. I thought, "Oh my goodness, Dougie had died." In those days, there used to be something called Thorpit, and I could always see him with shaking the Thorpit, which got stains off things, with a yellow duster, furiously, and the tiniest speck, like this. And then he'd look in the glass, straighten the tie, and say, "Well, never went out, I never leave this house until I look like Douglas Byng. Maybe the only time they ever see me, and you want to remember that, Dougie. You make the good impression, maybe the only impression. They are the public, they pay us. Well, it's the best I can do for the money." But after a while, he got fed up with the dressmaking place because he was desperate for his stage strike. And he answered an advertisement in the Stage for £2.50 a week to go to the Palisette at Hastings. And when he got there, he asked everybody, "Well, where's the Palisette Theatre?" And £2.10 a week. "Where's the Palace Theatre?" And they all laughed and kept pointing like that. Well, in the end, he found it. And it was a platform underneath an arch in the open air. But he learned his job there. And he met the first really great love of his life. And that was the love that rolls over from an audience, comes across the footlights and warms That was the biggest love in Dougie's life, and he met it at the Palisade in Hastings, and he had fans there, the Fisher Boys, and they found him indescribably funny, and they used to, they used to leave him tips on his landlady's doorstep. Dabs and mackerel and plaice. After that, there were years of touring. Number two theatres in musicals like the Girl in the Taxi, and he did a review with Harry Day called Crystals that went on for 2.5 years. He was playing lovely parts and getting good money. And all he could do was talk about the West End. And Harry Day's wife said, "You've got West Enditis. West Enditis." And the First World War came along. And of course, he failed his medical, this nerve thing, as he always described it. And then he had to start doing the rounds of the agents and the managements. And that can be very, very heart-breaking. But one night he went home to Catford and was rather nonchalant, and the family said, "Any luck today?" And he said, "Yes, I'm going to the Gaiety." And he'd finally broken into the West End, and he got a job understudying and playing tiny parts at the Gaiety. And we've all heard the stories of those Gaiety girls, but he said they were the most beautiful girls he ever saw, and he was very appreciative of female beauty. The most beautiful girls he ever saw. They did behave extraordinarily. They had no sense of the theatre at all. It was just a shop window for them. And for instance, a friend of his who was in the chorus, one night a boyfriend, Tiggy, was home from the front, and then he said, "Well, why don't you come and see the show tonight?" And she said, "Which show?" And he said, "This one." So she said, "Why not?" And they were all doing the show, and they suddenly looked up, and there she was in a box watching them. And from there, he went to the New Oxford Theatre, and it was here he first played Dame in panto. And he played a very small part, and he understudied the Dame, and he didn't really expect to get to play it. And so suddenly there was a rush to his dressing room, and they said, "You're on." And he said, "But I've only been here a fortnight, I've never rehearsed it, and I've not got any costume. The wardrobe hadn't given me anything." So they said, "Never mind, you've got friends." And the girls in the show gave him a coat, and a pair of Directoire bloomers, and a rather short dress, and some gloves, and on he bounded. And then he noticed that some ladies in the front row did a little dance, and some ladies in the front row were lowering their eyes, and the conductor was going like that. He thought, "Well, I don't know what this is all about." Anyway, in the interval, the conductor came panting round and said, "Dougie, I'm afraid you were showing all you've got." The bloomers split, and Dougie said, "Whatever did it look like?" He said, "Well, it looked like an orchid on a black velvet cushion." A friend of mine here, I warned her there would be one story she wouldn't like. He was earning good money, but Cochrane was the important, the enormous person, and Cochrane was advertising for young men. They were virtually chorus parts, they were small parts and understudies, and he went off and auditioned for it, and from getting £15 a week, he went back to 5. Everybody said he was mad. But he said, "No, this is the man who can get Messine and Lippard to choreograph for him, who can get Picasso to design a backdrop, Stravinsky to compose a ballet. No, this is the person to be. This is where it's all at." It was all at the London Pavilion, and in all he spent 5 years there. And he said it was how other people think of their days at Oxford. He thinks of his time at the London Pavilion as where he learned about his job and learned about life. And so in the first show he had to understudy Archie Baskin, and he opened at Manchester, and Archie Baskin was already in a show, so he had to play, he had to go on for him. And he It was a sketch called Oranges and Lemons, set in a Bloomsbury boarding house. And he and Ernest Thesiger played two old ladies undressing for bed underneath their nightdresses, putting their nightdresses on first. But he copied everything he'd seen his mother and his aunts do, so the corsets all came off. But it was all covered, it was all respectable and decent. And they were terribly refined. The one said, "Oh, I do wish my daughter Amy was here. She do make a party go soon." and then she said, "Oh, she's a guy, oh, laugh." I remember one Xmas at the Cleveland Hydro Swanage, and it was that line that caused Dougie no card to fall for him in a big way. He said, "Dougie, I wrote Christmas and you changed it to Xmas, and it's sublime and so much better." And that was the beginning of his friendship with Noel Coward, but he was still understudying it. They went to Manchester, and he went on, and he had a great personal triumph. But then Archie Bascom arrived up and said, "Yeah, it's a good little sketch. What size shoes do you wear?" So Dougie told him. He said, "Oh, good. Those shoes will fit me when we get to London." And it was awful. It was like a slap in the face. But Archie Bascom's role was the role he was understudying, and he thought he'd have to go back into the wings. But that's not what happened. The other show picked up, and still he didn't know whether he was going to open or not. And he got a telegram from Romney Brent that said, "Congratulations." And then he met Noel Coward in the theatre, backstage. And Noel Coward said, "You're not going to be good in this show, Dougie. You're going to be amazing." And he made his name. He made his name in review there. And suddenly, of course, the money went up. He went from one review to the next at the London Pavilion. He was starring at the Café de Paris in Cabaret. And at one point, the owner of the Bagatelle said, to the owner of the Café de Paris, could Dougie come to us? He said, "Well, it's a totally different clientele. I don't see why not." So he was doing 3 shows a night. It was the London Pavilion, the Café de Paris. He thought he was going to open quietly at the Bagatelle, but he went to Ascot that afternoon. And there was a play going over the racecourse with Douglas Byng opens tonight. Douglas Byng opens tonight. And that was the point when he moved to the Hyde Park Hotel. Long gone were the days of Catford. And he used to walk home along Piccadilly, and all the ladies of the night knew him, and they used to say, "Good night, Doug, good night." And he was a West End star, and he was happy. So he got no public honour, but the charts knew him, and for him that was enough. It was enough. And of course, he was at the Café de Paris, billed to appear at the Café de Paris the night he was hit by the bomb that went right through the place. And he always says 3 people saved his life that night. He was also appearing at the Colosseum, and the manager of the Colosseum tried to get them to go and take shelter in an air raid, and he said no, he wouldn't. The taxi didn't turn up, and not only was he appearing at those 2, but he was doing Queen Charlotte's Ball for debutantes. And so he said, "I'm going to be hungry." So they stopped at that coquille next to the little restaurant next to the Noel Coward Theatre. And they stopped there, and the man said, "Well, it'll take a quarter of an hour to make them." So in the end, they ran as far as the Colosseum with the taxi following them. And he heard a low whine. But his was the name on the gold easel that always stood outside, and his was the photograph. And he pushed through the door, and there was a blackout curtain behind. And he pulled that back, and a man was carrying out a woman with blood literally dripping from his fingertips. And he said, "It's carnage in there." And all Dougie had heard was a dull thud. "It's carnage in there." And he looked, and the balcony, the bomb had come through the glass dome up there, had hit the balcony. The balcony had fallen down into the orchestra. His great friend, Snake Hips Johnson, the band leader, was killed instantly, and there were dead bodies lying everywhere. And Dougie being Dougie, went on and did Queen Charlotte's Ball. But he really loved Sir Kipps Johnson. He loved all black people. And when he finally came to go to New York, Cole Porter took him for the first time to Harlem. Well, Dougie never needed showing how to press the lift button twice. He went back every night he was there. He had wonderful, wonderful times, wonderful friendships of every kind. And he never got home till dawn. And then he decided he wanted to entertain them back. He always described to me, oh, they were wonderful entertainers, born entertainers. And so he thought, well, I can't have them at the night time because Colour Bar was there in a great big way. So he went to the manager of the hotel and said, do you know anywhere here off Broadway where I could give a party? And they said, well, you could have it here. And he said that, what in my suite? And they said, no, we could find you a room. And it was all set up. Then they came to him and said, Mr. Byng, there's just one thing. Your friends will have to come in by the tradesman's entrance. And he said, no way. I'd rather not have a party. And in the end, he managed to find somewhere else, but they were his friends, and they were not coming in by the tradesman's entrance. And when I found out that because he did the musical comedies, he did The Bird Cellar with Richard Tauber conducting it. Richard Tauber in the orchestra pit, who called him Bingy. Bingy, every night was Bingy. And then he did Maritza. Now Maritza's supposed to have a whammy on it. It's an unlucky show. It's had great success in some European cities, but it was always said that it would never ever open in England. And Dougie was given carte blanche with his own party, which was the leading man called Alfonso. And so he did that. On the opening night, he had a huge success. And of course, his first entrance, he came on as Alfonso disguised as a lady violinist, singing I'm the Pest of Budapest. And when the curtain went up, the curtain went down, huge applause. And then he saw a little man had crept onto the stage. And of course, he turned to the cast and said, ladies and gentlemen, it's the composer, it's Herr Kalman. And the curtain came down, so the audience had no idea Kalman himself was there. But Kalman said to him, Mr. Byng, you have taken one of my greatest love songs and turned it into a comedy. And I loved it. When I first knew him, he was appearing in Hotel Paradiso at the Winter Gardens Theatre. And I went round, I used to go round quite often. I went round one night, when the show was over, and he was sitting there, and he had tears in his eyes, and he grabbed hold of me like this. And I said, whatever's wrong? And he said, oh, Tony, John Gielgud was just here, and do you know what he said? He said, Dougie, you are a very great actor. And he was. My own ship came in, and I signed a contract with Granada. And, television didn't mean very much to him. He'd done some of the early experiments with freeze green. Oh, and then broadcast from Alexandra Palace. Oh, you have to this little paint your face up here in yellow and give you black mouths. I said, no, it's not like that a bit anymore. Oh, well, it's very nice, very, very, very nice indeed, but it wasn't the theatre. And problems had started to rise, really, because he'd started to notice that I was drinking more. And this did not suit. He never actually told me off for it. Never, that wasn't his way. But he would start to tell more and more stories about his former review partner, Lance Lister, who really drank himself out of the West End. And then he would tell the story about Evelyn Cochrane, Cochrane's wife, and somebody who was very, very fond of booze. And somebody said to her, the thing is, even in the morning when you fancy that first drink, why don't you have an apple instead? And then perhaps you could have another. And she said, well, I can't eat 14 apples before lunch. And then he belonged in a world that was Noel and Gertie, Jack and Bee. It was all Christian names. And somehow they were being forced out a bit into the code. Something new was happening. Plays by John Osborne and Sheila Delaney were happening. And then I wrote Coronation Street, and it was happening on television. And I really do think, in Dougie's eyes, I have joined the enemy. And there was a slight constraint, but even so, there was still a very affectionate friendship. Then a management commissioned me to do a play for the West End, and I wanted to do a play for Dougie and for Avis Bunnage, who was a great friend of mine. And this play was, because it has bigger curts on it as Maritza. But I wrote the part of a female impersonator who had a daughter, who was then incapable of being a true woman because she'd been brought up by drag queens. And, I mean, how he had a daughter only because he'd once had a yeast fight in Nottingham. It's an extraordinary. But I was very young. And I've read it again recently, and actually there's some very good stuff in it. I think I might do it. I've provided somewhere. It's a period piece. So I sent it to Dougie, and very good management, and a director, Vida Hope, who directed The Boyfriend, and just done Valmouth, and was red hot, and wildly enthusiastic about the piece. Backers queuing up galore, and Dougie read it. No telephone call, a letter. We always wrote to one another. We wrote to one another copiously. And the letter said, "It's too near to home, Dougie." So he was the only person I didn't mind calling me Dougie. Dougie or dearie. It's too near to home, Dougie. And what is more, I don't think the public are ready for it. Nor do I think they will ever be. I was having drinks with a matron of a London hospital the other day, and she said, such people ought to be shot. So that was the end of that. And then I went to America, and the person who came back from America was not the boy acolyte the one who did knitting patterns when Aught Else Failed, and played Elspeth March and Cyril Raymond's son when everything was going well. I wasn't that person at all. I was somebody, I wasn't well tailored anymore or well groomed. I perished, I thought. It was the late 60s. I banished all that. I was dressed in a rag bag. If I'd been to California, to Berkeley, to San Francisco, and then come back via Soho in New York and Greenwich Village. I was dressed in an assortment of rag bag Greenwich Village clothes. I had hair down to here. I had a drink problem that was increasing all the time. And I'd begun to form an addiction to hard drugs. I was never banished. I banished myself. I thought, this will not do, this will not make him happy. But I continued to write him letters, and I continued to get very affectionate letters back, and always did. And then I heard he was going to do a show with Billy Milton. Well, warning bells did not sound, because Billy Milton was a name that I don't know what Billy had ever done to him. Billy was a charming man. When I was very young, I met Billy once, and in next to no time, I was doing cabaret, and he'd given me trying to do it, and given me a cabaret number that he'd written himself, and gave me the rights to do it, all for nothing. And it doesn't come much kinder than that in my business. But Dougie, though, there was always something wrong. Billy Milton did not suit. He would say, oh, Billy, yes. Very good in a room, but no good on the stage. Oh, no good on the stage. And I heard they were in a show together. Well, I think the whole of Brighton probably remembers the stories of how they fought on and off stage. But then worse was, and then of course it was the National. And although, by the grace of God, I'd found my way back to myself by then, I didn't feel I could go. I felt I'd lost the right. And I wish I had gone now. Because the last thing I heard was very, very sad. His great fear in life was Denville Hall, the actors' retirement home. And that's where he was, and he used to say, oh, they make you drink tea out of a pot mug. And I said, I'd bring you a china cup if necessary. And I never took the china cup because I didn't think he'd want me to see him in reduced circumstances, and it would have been too awkward, and I still feel badly about it. But he was a great figure in my life, and I loved him dearly. And I told you at the beginning that Dougie had a connection with this church. Well, you can all go and play Hunt the Window, because Dougie's grandfather married a Miss Shelley of Brighton, and Miss Shelley's father was the beadle of Brighton and was the sexton of this church, and his name's on a window over there. So I just hope some way or another Dougie has managed to find his way through the ether and been here today and heard what I had to say. And Dougie was the best I could do for the moment.
Right, we're going to throw it open to you lot now. Does anyone have any questions? No? I always get this response. No one has a question. Everyone sits on the... Ah!
I have a question.
Yes.
This story was quite interesting. Because it must have been late 60s, early 70s. I got to know someone who also knew Dougie. Sorry, I can't remember his name now. It was at the time when Dougie, for the first time in his life, was going to have to wear spectacles. Now, as you said, he was very particular about his personal appearance. And this didn't go down well at all. So eventually, when the optician got in touch with Dougie and said, your spectacles are ready for collection, Mr. B, he got in touch with this friend of mine and said, I've got to go and collect me new specs. I'm not looking forward to it. Keep me company, come and hold me hand. So they go down to the optician together, and the optician hands the spectacles to Dougie and said, there you are, would you care to try your new spectacles on? And he sort of stood near and done this sort of business, you see, and say, oh dear, they don't do much for me, do they? And then he turned to my friend and said, I look at you through them, they don't do much for you either.
Any further questions? There's rather a nice story that I remember about Dougie. There was a lady novelist, and I use the term lady novelist advisedly, who lived on Arundel Terrace, called Kay Dick. She didn't have a television, and she used to invite herself along to Dougie's if there was a programme she wanted to watch. On one occasion, he became rather irritated by her insistence that she didn't care for the programme she'd wanted to see, and would he mind changing the channel? It's my television and my flat, Dougie said. I do object to changing the channel. Miss Dick left. A few days later, Dougie was on the front steps as Kay came tottering along the street. I thought I'd better make it up with him, she told me. And I said, "Oh, Dougie, how are you today?" He said, "Shouldn't you hurry home, dear? Your cauldron's about to boil over."
Talking of arable terraces reminded me of when Dougie first moved there. His landlord was Bobby Fleming, who I'd known a long time. And Robert Fleming had been a movie star, a big West End leading man, had had an impressive television career, and Bobby was a friend of mine. And he really was a very nice and considerate man. And so when I arrived, Dougie had this ground floor flat, really 2 rooms, kitchen and bath, but again by this strange thing, you thought, well, beyond that bull desk there, with all the photographs as always there, but somehow there'll be another suite of rooms. But as I went in, Dougie said, you were talking to them in the hall. So I said, yes. So he said, they've not asked you for drinks, have they? So I said, well, they have, as a matter of fact, this evening. Have they? So I got dressed, and I said, well, about 6 o'clock, shall we go up? He said, was there any mention of me? So I said, well, no, there wasn't. And he said, no, well, you must go up, you've accepted the invitation. Of course you must go up. I tell you, to have refused that would have brought down even more ire. So I went, and I came downstairs, and he said, they've never had me up there, never. And I think it was because Bobby didn't want him to feel that he was a cabaret permanently on tap. But Dougie chose not to see it like that. And Dougie, by that time, was receiving King George's Fund pension. Now, King George's Fund pension is an honour, but it does have money with it. Zena Dare, as Dougie said, bloody, I'd better not carry on with what he said. She didn't know it was money. She sent it back. So when I came downstairs after this party, Dougie had plainly been thinking. And he said, if my landlord puts up my rent, I shall go to the secretary of the King George's Fund and put the matter to him. And I said, well, who is the secretary of the King George's Fund? And he said, my landlord. You didn't snub Douglas Byng easily.
There's just only some confusion about pronunciation of his name. I don't know what to say. Sorry.
I can't hear you, can you?
Byng.
Byng. Pronunciation of his name.
Oh, Byng, yes.
Right, if no one has any questions...
Well, I just wanted to say, this isn't a question really, but you mentioned Hawes and Curtis.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, how many people here remember?
Oh, Hawes and Curtis.
Hawes and Curtis.
They made all, when he went to America, they made all his clothes for free. And I mean, Dougie taught me all kinds of tricks.
Well, Ellie, because
I thought
knew
he...
the man who was the head cutter there.
Yes.
Ginger hair.
Yes.
I can't remember his surname. We knew him very well in the Harrow area. And he was Mountbatten's batman. And when the war ended, he became the owner of Hawes and Curtis.
Oh, my
this
goodness.
little cockney ginger-haired man who'd been there coming. That's all. Nothing really to do
But
with it.
and they made Dougie his first suit of tails in navy blue, because it was decided in the 30s that navy blue lit to a better black on the stage than black did. Well, finally, he bequeathed, or not bequeathed, but during his lifetime, gave me that set of tails. I wore them a couple of times, and then nobody wore tails anyway ever after that. And they were last seen going down the King's Road in 1969, being worn by a friend of mine with red, white, and blue trousers and a top hat.
Right. I'd like to say thank you very much for being a nice, receptive audience. Thank you very much for Tony for trekking down from Manchester twice because he left his medication behind and went back up. And it's been a lovely afternoon.